Jeff Sessions rolling back major DOJ policies and civil rights protections. So this story happens to be leaking out on a holiday Friday. So let's forget the tweets. This is a story about what the Trump administration is doing. The New York Times reporting DOJ files showing Sessions making these reversals on civil rights, rights for the disabled, legal immigrants, explosives, and the formerly incarcerated. Sessions canceling 25 different policies. The Trump administration argues that these policies went too far beyond the laws they were based on. But the people behind some of these policies, like former AG Eric Holder, argue they were needed to modernize rules and protect rights. Take, for example, the guidance that came out of Ferguson, where a Holder probe did not find evidence that Mike Brown's shooting was a crime, but it did find police abusing power and forcing citizens into debt for nonviolent crimes. So here are the facts. That Holder probe found when Ferguson police pulled people over, 8 out of 10 were black. And the policy that Jeff Sessions is canceling was trying to prevent racial discrimination and debt traps. Or another one, an Obama-era policy that said employers should not segregate people with developmental disabilities if that can be reasonably avoided. Advocates for people with disabilities today arguing that rule was protecting their rights, and with Jeff Sessions withdrawing it, there is a fear it will be harder to enforce laws protecting those citizens. As promised, I turn back to the Washington Post's E.J. Dionne. An important story, E.J. Do you think these policy changes are concerning, and why are they coming out tonight?
Well, I think they're concerning, and I'm glad you're doing this story because I think one of the reasons this big pile was released right around now is a lot of people's minds are either on the tax bill or on the coming holidays, and it was a great way to get them out there without much scrutiny. A colleague and I were looking around, and yes, there were good stories in the Times and in the Washington Post, but they just didn't get a lot of attention. And I think this is the underground government that Donald Trump is running that I think the media are going to really have to turn to in 2018, because while we have focused on the tweets and on the legitimately on the investigation, rule after rule after rule that was made in the Obama years has been undercut. In this case, you listed the groups affected there, the fines, excessive fines on people, civil rights issues, disability issues, guns and explosives. These are a big deal, and they are doing this with very, very little public scrutiny. And that is why we are talking about it on a night when a lot of people would prefer to think about Christmas gifts.
Right, which, by the way, you're welcome to think about both. You know, the human mind is a vast
I believe
place. That. EJ, I mean, let me read to you. We contacted the NAACP Legal Defense Fund about this story today. They said rescinding these key resources is not just irresponsible, it's another example of the department shirking an obligation to protect civil rights and ensure compliance with the law. It's also striking because Ferguson and some of those issues got a lot of attention at the time. And the changes sometimes are really, I guess, more dry, or some would argue boring, than the drama of the original story. And yet it's the systemic changes that matter. When you look at the stat I mentioned, that 8 out of 10 people being pulled over there are African-American, nonviolent offenses, driving stops that lead to this debt trap that Eric Holder talked about. I would just argue or observe that I don't think it's a left or right proposition that the police should not be putting nonviolent people in unaffordable debt traps. And that policy that's now being revoked today by Jeff Sessions makes it harder to combat that.
No, that's right. And libertarian conservatives, at least some of them at the time, spoke out against this and said government shouldn't finance themselves with unjust fines levied in a discriminatory way, which is what was going on there. And this is why we have federal civil rights laws. Vanita Gupta, who worked in the Civil Rights Division under President Obama, told the Washington Post that what revoking these rules means is that communities that were reluctant to reform will no longer feel any pressure to reform and could well go back to the practices that we learned are very discriminatory and just basically wrong.